Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments. Which part of the story touched your heart? Tell in the comments. I love to hear from you. Elizabeth Chloe had lived her entire life in Blackwood, Virginia, a town where the mist never seemed to fully disappear, where the forest stretched endlessly like secrets whispering through the trees. She had grown up in a world of routine: early morning coffee at the only diner in town, slow walks past old houses with peeling paint, and quiet evenings spent curled up with a book. Blackwood wasn't a place where exciting things happened. But that night, everything changed. The rain had started to drizzle as Elizabeth stepped into Whitaker's bookstore, the bell above the door chiming softly. The scent of aged paper and ink filled the small, dimly lit space. She ran her fingers along the spines of forgotten stories, lost in her own world. And then she felt it, a presence. She turned her head slightly, just enough to see him standing there, a stranger. He wasn't browsing books. He was watching her. Dressed in a perfectly tailored black suit, his tall frame was almost too perfect, too composed. His dark hair was slicked back neatly, and his pale blue eyes held an unnatural stillness, like the surface of an untouched lake. Elizabeth swallowed, feeling a strange chill creep up her spine. He didn't belong in Blackwood. People here were rough around the edges, hunters, farmers, and townsfolk who had lived in the same houses for generations. But he was different, and then he spoke. "You like old books?" His voice was deep, smooth, almost hypnotic. Elizabeth hesitated before answering. "Yes." A small, unreadable smile touched his lips. "Then you must appreciate history." She nodded, not sure why her throat felt dry. "I do." He reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a folded document. She glanced at it, confused. It wasn't a book. Then he placed it on the table beside her, and when she unfolded it, her breath hitched. Elizabeth's hands trembled as she read the words. Her name was already on it. "What is this?" she asked, forcing herself to meet his gaze. He remained eerily calm. "An opportunity." "For what?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He stepped closer, his scent a mix of expensive cologne and something colder. "I need a wife." He said it so simply, as if it were as common as asking for a cup of coffee. "And I believe you're the right one." Elizabeth's heart pounded in her chest. This had to be a joke. "You don't even know me." His gaze didn't waver. "I will." She took a step back. I don't understand. Why me?" There were 100 more questions racing through her mind, but something about him, the way he carried himself, the absolute certainty in his voice, made her afraid to ask. "I've chosen you," he said simply. Her instinct screamed, "Run!" but her feet wouldn't move. Her fingers gripped the marriage contract tightly, as if touching it would make it real. "This is insane." "No," she said firmly, shaking her head. "I don't know who you are, but this is not normal." His expression didn't change. If anything, his eyes darkened. "You will," he repeated, as if it were already decided. And then, just like that, he turned and walked toward the door, leaving her standing there, breathless and shaken. As the door closed behind him, a cold gust of wind swept through the bookstore, making the lights flicker. Elizabeth looked down at the contract still sitting on the table. Her name, his name, Joseph Jackson. She had never met him before. So why did it feel like he had been waiting for her all along? Elizabeth barely remembered how she got home that night. She sat at the edge of her bed, staring at the contract in her hands, the ink on the paper smudging slightly from her fingers. Why would a man like him, a millionaire, come to a small town like Blackwood to find a wife? It didn't make sense. And yet, something inside her whispered, this wasn't a coincidence. Joseph Jackson had planned this, and he wasn't going to take no for an answer. That night, sleep did not come easily. Elizabeth tossed and turned, her mind racing with questions. And then, she heard it. A car, slowly rolling past her house. Her bedroom window overlooked the road, and as she peered through the curtains, her breath caught. A sleek, black car was parked just down the street, and inside, behind the glass, were pale blue eyes watching her. Elizabeth told herself to forget about Joseph Jackson. She told herself it was just a strange encounter, one that would fade away like an unsettling dream. But it didn't. His pale blue eyes haunted her thoughts. His voice, calm and commanding, echoed in her mind. And when the black car appeared in front of her family's small house 1 week later, she knew this wasn't over. She stepped onto the porch, heart pounding as a man in a sharp black suit exited the vehicle. He was not Joseph, but something about him carried the same eerie stillness. He handed her an envelope. She hesitated before opening it, her breath catching as she pulled out stacks of crisp, fresh bills. $500,000 in cash. A shudder ran through her. "This is from Mr. Jackson," the man said, his voice void of emotion. "His offer still stands." She barely heard the words before her mother's gasp filled the air. Her father, silent for years about their struggles, stared at the money as if it were salvation itself. "Elizabeth," her mother whispered, gripping her arm tightly, "do you understand what this means?" Elizabeth did understand. $500,000. Money that could change their lives forever. Money that could erase years of debt, fear, and uncertainty. Her mother's eyes pleaded. Her father's silence begged. "It's just marriage," her mother said. "You don't have to love him. Just say yes. Just say yes." Against every instinct, against every scream in her head, telling her to run. She did. The evening air was thick and heavy as Elizabeth sat in the back seat of the black car, hands clasped tightly in her lap. The driver never spoke. The road stretched endlessly, winding through the deep, unwelcoming forest outside Blackwood. Tall, gnarled trees cast jagged shadows across the road, illuminated only by the car's dim headlights. She could feel it, the isolation. The further they went, the more suffocating it became. She wanted to turn back. She wanted to scream, to demand they turn the car around. But she had already said yes. After what felt like an eternity, the trees finally parted, revealing something out of a nightmare. A mansion, massive, gothic, overpowering. It sat on the edge of a blackened lake, its towering windows staring down at her like hollow eyes. Dark ivy crept up its stone walls, strangling the structure as if the earth itself was trying to reclaim it. The house felt alive, like it was watching her. The car stopped at the iron gates, and they groaned as they slowly swung open. She gripped the door handle so tightly her knuckles turned white. And then, before she could breathe, the front doors of the mansion creaked open. He was waiting for her. Joseph Jackson stood at the entrance, his suit as crisp as ever, his hands casually in his pockets. His icy blue eyes met hers, unreadable as always. He didn't smile. He didn't greet her with warmth. Instead, he simply tilted his head slightly. "Welcome home, Elizabeth." A shiver crawled down her spine. Home? She stepped out of the car, her heartbeat hammering in her chest. Joseph extended a hand toward her, but something in his posture felt calculated. She hesitated before placing her hand in his. His fingers were cold, too cold. The moment their skin touched, she felt it, a strange energy, something ancient and unknowable. And then, in the dim glow of the mansion's lights, she swore his lips twitched into the faintest smile, like he had won. The air inside the mansion was heavier than outside. Candles flickered along the walls, casting long, eerie shadows. The ceilings stretched impossibly high, lined with chandeliers that seemed to hold whispers within their crystals. A grand staircase loomed ahead, splitting into two separate hallways, one leading left, one leading right. To her surprise, there were no servants, no staff bustling about, just silence. She swallowed. Joseph led her down the hall, his footsteps eerily soft against the stone floors. And then he said something that made her blood freeze. "There are rules in this house, Elizabeth." She stopped walking. "Rules?" she echoed, voice barely above a whisper. He turned to her, his expression unreadable. "Yes. 3, to be exact." She felt the walls closing in. Number 1, never enter the West Wing. Number 2, never leave the mansion after dark. Number 3, never ask about my past. Elizabeth's pulse pounded in her ears. This wasn't normal. None of this was normal. And yet she couldn't move. His gaze pinned her in place. Then, as if nothing had happened, he turned and continued walking. The moment she stepped past the threshold of her new home, the doors behind her slammed shut. And in that instant, she knew. She had made a terrible mistake. That night, she lay in her enormous bed, staring at the ceiling. The room was beautiful, but she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The house creaked and groaned like it was breathing. And then, somewhere in the darkness, a whisper. Elizabeth sat up sharply, her breath caught in her throat. She wasn't alone. She turned her head slowly, her heart racing. The door to her room was slightly open, and outside in the dimly lit hallway, she saw a shadow. It wasn't Joseph. It was something else, and it was waiting. The days passed in a fog. Elizabeth tried to adjust. She walked the endless halls trying to learn the shape of her new home, but the house was too large, too quiet, too alive. Joseph was a mystery she couldn't solve. He barely spoke to her. He never touched her. He was there, but somehow not. Every dinner was the same. He sat across from her at the massive dining table, candlelight flickering between them. "Did you sleep well?" he would ask. She would nod, though it was a lie, because she didn't sleep well. She never did. The mansion wasn't silent at night. No, that was when it came alive. The old walls groaned. The chandeliers swayed when there was no wind. And in the late hours when she lay staring at the ceiling, she heard them. Whispers. Soft, warning whispers. She couldn't make out the words, but they weren't coming from her head. They were in the hallways, just outside her door. Watching, waiting. One night she pressed her ear against the wood, trying to hear them better. The voices stopped. Then, a knock. Her breath caught in her throat. She stepped back, heart hammering. "Joseph," she whispered. No answer. The silence after was worse than the voices. Days turned into weeks, and the whispers never stopped. She explored when she could, walking down halls lined with old, haunting portraits. Most of the doors were locked, but she always knew where the west wing began. She could feel it, a hallway where the air was colder, where the light didn't reach. She had never dared step toward it. But then, one night she saw it, the door, unlocked. She stared at it from across the hall, her pulse a wild drum in her chest. The rules. She wasn't supposed to enter, but her feet moved before she could stop them. One step, then another. And then, her hand was on the doorknob. Slowly she turned it. The door creaked open, and she stepped inside. The air inside was different, thick with dust, heavy with something else. Something wrong. The room was a study. Bookshelves covered the walls, their spines faded with age. An old wooden desk sat in the center, a single candle burning atop it. Someone had been here, recently. Then, her eyes landed on it. The portrait. Her breath left her in a single, sharp gasp. A woman, with the same face. Her face. Elizabeth stumbled back, her hands shaking. This wasn't possible. The woman in the painting had her same high cheekbones, the same full lips, the same piercing brown eyes. But it wasn't her. Her gaze dropped to the plaque beneath the frame. The name carved into the brass made her blood turn to ice. Anne Marie Jackson. The room spun. Joseph's first wife. And she was dead. The whispers had warned her. She should have listened. Footsteps echoed behind her, and she whirled around. Joseph stood in the doorway. His face was unreadable, but his eyes, they weren't cold anymore. They were furious. "What are you doing in here?" His voice was calm. Too calm. Elizabeth's throat was dry. She couldn't speak. Joseph stepped forward. The candlelight flickered against his sharp features. "You weren't supposed to see that," he murmured. Her heartbeat was a wild, desperate thing. "You lied to me," she whispered. Joseph tilted his head. "I never lied. You simply never asked." Her nails dug into her palms. "Who was she?" He didn't answer. The silence stretched too long. She took a step back. "Is she—" Her voice cracked. "Is she dead?" Joseph's expression didn't change. But then softly, "She's gone. Gone. Not dead. Gone." A shiver ran down Elizabeth's spine. "What happened to her?" His jaw clenched. "That's a question you don't want the answer to." She swallowed hard, her stomach twisting. She needed to leave. But when she turned toward the door, His voice stopped her in her tracks. "You should have followed the rules, Elizabeth." Her breath hitched. His tone wasn't threatening, but something about it made her blood run cold. And in that moment, she knew. She wasn't the first, and she wouldn't be the last. Morning light crept through the towering windows of the mansion, casting long, cold shadows across the marble floors. Elizabeth hadn't slept. Not after last night. Not after what she had seen. She couldn't stop thinking about the portrait. About Anne-Marie. She looked just like me. The thought churned in her stomach as she wandered through the mansion, her hands trembling at her sides. She had to know more. Who was she? What happened to her? And most importantly, was Joseph responsible? By midday, she found herself in the library, one of the few rooms where she felt safe. The massive bookshelves towered over her, filled with stories from long before her time. But she wasn't looking for stories. She was looking for the truth. She ran her fingers along the dusty wooden shelves, scanning the book spines until a shift. One of the books moved slightly as if it had been placed there recently. She pulled it out, and behind it, stuffed deep into the shelf, was an old newspaper. Elizabeth's breath caught as she unfolded the fragile paper, her fingers trembling. The headline made her blood freeze. "Millionaire Joseph Jackson's wife mysteriously vanishes. Body never found." Her stomach twisted violently. The article detailed how Anne-Marie Jackson had disappeared without a trace. Joseph had told police she left in the middle of the night, that she had been unhappy. But there was no evidence. No note. No body. Nothing. Elizabeth's hands clenched around the fragile pages. She had married a man whose wife had disappeared, and now she was living in her place. A cold sweat covered her skin. She needed to leave. Tonight. That night, she packed a small bag, just enough to run. Her hands shook as she shoved clothes into it, her heartbeat thundering in her ears. She had no plan, no money, but she had to escape. Before she disappeared, too. A sudden creak of the floorboards made her freeze. Footsteps. Her breath hitched. Someone was outside her door. Slowly she turned, her pulse roaring in her ears. And then the door opened. Joseph stood in the doorway. For the first time since their marriage, he had entered her bedroom. His pale blue eyes were unreadable. But something in his gaze made her stomach lurch. Something dark. "You went into the West Wing." His voice was calm. Too calm. Elizabeth swallowed hard. I got lost." Joseph stepped inside. His presence filled the room. His movements were slow, controlled, but she could feel it. The shift, the danger. "You saw her, didn't you?" His voice was softer now, almost amused. Elizabeth forced herself to remain calm. "Saw who?" A slow smile spread across his lips, but his eyes remained empty. "She looked just like you." The air in the room thickened. Elizabeth's heart pounded so violently she thought it might crack her ribs. Joseph took another step closer. She took one back. "Run." Her instincts screamed at her. "Run now." But Joseph leaned in, his breath warm against her ear as he whispered, "You won't leave, Elizabeth." Not like she did. Her blood turned to ice. She wasn't imagining it. He knew. He knew what happened to Anne-Marie. And now, she was next. Elizabeth's mind raced. She needed to get out. Now, her eyes darted to the door, calculating. She could make a run for it. But Joseph was faster, stronger, and worse, he was expecting it. He stepped back slightly, watching her with something almost playful. "I know what you're thinking," he murmured. Elizabeth clenched her fists. "I don't know what you're talking about." Joseph sighed, shaking his head. "Lying doesn't suit you, Elizabeth." Her stomach twisted. Something about the way he said her name made her feel caged, like she was already his possession. "You think I hurt her?" he continued, tilting his head slightly. She refused to answer. His smile widened. "I didn't." Her breath hitched. His gaze darkened. "But that doesn't mean she's alive." Elizabeth's vision blurred. Her legs threatened to give out. This was a game to him, a slow, twisted game, and she was losing. Joseph watched her in silence for a moment. Then he reached forward and gently tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. The gesture should have been intimate, Instead, it made her skin crawl. His fingers lingered for just a second too long before he pulled away. And then he turned to leave. He paused at the doorway. "You should get some rest," he said without turning back. Elizabeth stood frozen, unable to breathe. His voice was quiet when he spoke again. "You have a long future here." The door clicked shut behind him, and Elizabeth knew. She was trapped. Elizabeth knew she had one chance to survive, one chance to escape before Joseph made her disappear like Anne-Marie. She had spent the entire day pretending she wasn't terrified, pretending she hadn't seen the newspaper, pretending she hadn't felt the noose tightening around her neck. At dinner, she had smiled when he spoke, nodded at the right moments, laughed when she was supposed to, because if Joseph even suspected she was planning to run, he wouldn't let her. Not alive. Now the mansion was silent. Joseph had gone to bed. Elizabeth waited until the darkness in the halls felt thick and heavy, until she was sure he had fallen asleep. And then, heart pounding in her chest, she grabbed the flashlight she had hidden under the mattress and rushed toward the west wing. The hallway was pitch black. Elizabeth moved quickly, her breath shallow. The air was colder here, as if the walls remembered things, terrible things. She reached the portrait. Anne-Marie's face stared back at her, the same face as hers, the same dark eyes, the same cruel fate, unless she changed it. With shaking hands, Elizabeth ran her fingers along the edge of the frame. It moved, not a painting, a door. She pushed. The heavy wood creaked, revealing a narrow opening behind it, a passage. Elizabeth swallowed her fear and stepped inside. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating a small windowless room. Her stomach twisted. It was silent, too silent. The walls were lined with shelves, filled with women's belongings, perfume bottles, jewelry, a comb tangled with long strands of hair. And then, in the center of the room, displayed on a mannequin, a wedding dress. Its ivory lace had dark stains. Elizabeth's breath caught. She stepped closer, the flashlight shaking in her grip. The stains were red, dried blood. A sob rose in her throat. She staggered back as the truth slammed into her. This was Anne-Marie's, and it was covered in her blood. A creak. Elizabeth turned. Joseph was standing in the doorway. Her heart stopped. His face was expressionless. But his eyes were cold, unfeeling, hungry. "I told you not to go in here," he said softly. His voice wasn't angry. It was calm, too calm, like he had already decided what he was going to do next. Kill her. Elizabeth's body reacted before her mind did. She ran. She lunged past him, shoving him hard against the doorframe. He stumbled. For the first time, Joseph's calm cracked. A flicker of surprise. He hadn't expected her to fight back. Good. She sprinted down the hallway, the flashlight bouncing wildly in her hand. Her lungs burned. Her feet pounded against the floor. Faster, faster. Behind her, footsteps. Steady, controlled. He wasn't running, because he knew there was nowhere to go. No way out. But he was wrong. Elizabeth had spent weeks studying the mansion, and she knew. The servants' stairwell. It was ahead. If she could reach it, she could get to the kitchen. And from there, outside. She turned a corner, legs screaming, heart pounding. And then, a hand clamped around her wrist. She shrieked, struggling, kicking, clawing. Joseph yanked her back hard. Her body slammed against his. His breath was warm against her ear. "I didn't want it to be like this," he murmured. Elizabeth's nails dug into his arm. He didn't flinch. "You ruined everything," he whispered. His grip tightened. Too tight. Her bones ached. She couldn't breathe. She had seconds before he overpowered her completely. Elizabeth's free hand fumbled wildly. And then, her fingers closed around something cold, something metal, the flashlight. Joseph grabbed her wrist. His grip was cold as ice. "You're not leaving, Elizabeth." But she refused to die like Anne-Marie. Using every ounce of strength, she kicked him hard in the chest. He stumbled back, knocking over a table. She ran, down the hall, down the stairs. She reached the front door, but it was locked. Joseph was right behind her. She grabbed the first thing she could, a heavy candlestick, and smashed it against his head. He collapsed. Elizabeth grabbed the house keys and ran into the woods. She ran until she reached the highway. A passing trucker saw her, bruised, bleeding, terrified. She screamed, "Help me!" And he did. The next morning, the police arrived at Joseph's mansion. They searched the West Wing and found Anne Marie's body, buried behind the walls. Joseph was arrested. The newspapers called it the Blackwood widow case. Elizabeth testified in court. She became the girl who survived the mansion. And when it was over, she stood outside the courthouse, breathing in the fresh air. She was free. She was alive. And Joseph Jackson, he would never touch another woman again.